Okay, so this is the invasive plant sales in Hawaii. We're hoping to provide you with some information and bust some myths tonight. As we get started, one of the myths that we start out with is that if it ships here or sold here, it is safe, and that is not actually the case. So whenever you visit some of these box stores or a nursery or a garden center or buy plants online, don't be fooled that just because you got it and it can ship here, it's safe. And we'll just give you some quick examples. This example was pulled from Craigslist just a couple days ago. Someone on Kauai is selling glory bush. While this is something that is invasive, known to be here in Hawaii and invasive, it's also on the noxious weed list as it's a Tibicina plant. Doesn't mean that they can't ship you seeds. So if you go to plantpono.org, you can look this plant up and you'll find that it is a high risk and it has a score of 10, which means that it has the potential to be weedy here in Hawaii. Another one that we come across here on eBay, we have for sale actually Chromalina odorata. This is also known as devilweed. This is also on the noxious weed list, but it's also one of these plants that's being promoted as something completely different called Mexican dream herb. Another one that we came across is Tree of Heaven. And this one is known to be invasive and pretty invasive, not just here in Hawaii, but all across the United States. And people are selling this on eBay. I went ahead and tried to buy this plant and there was no issue with it shipping to Hawaii. And another one, this has gotten a lot of popularity lately. This is pampas grass. And pampas grass is known to be invasive here in Hawaii, but there's a little bit of complexity to this plant, and we're going to go into that a little bit later on. But you can buy these plumes on Etsy, and it will ship here to Hawaii. So the myth that it is safe doesn't really apply here. Just because you can buy it here in Hawaii doesn't mean that it doesn't have the potential to be invasive. And then lastly, this is another popular one, are raspberry and blackberry bushes. One of these is actually Himalayan blackberry. It's actually a target of OWASP. We're trying to eradicate it here on Oahu. It's caused a lot of problems in the Pacific Northwest, and that's where this person is selling it from, out of Etsy. So you have to watch what you buy online, and we're going to talk about why some of these things can actually be shipped here to Hawaii. So the myth, just because it's safe, is busted.
Oops. All right. And I have the pleasure of talking about the legal foundations for prohibiting the movement and sale of invasive plants in Hawaii. So there is no one definition of invasive species that applies to all federal and state laws. The one I put here on the screen is pretty commonly accepted. It's an executive order that has been around for a long time. It says an invasive species means with regard to a particular ecosystem, a non-native organism whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human, animal, or plant health. So that's pretty broad. So you think, great, let's take that definition and put it in our law book and make a Hawaii invasive plant list. Oops, next slide, please. Well, you can't. There is no list of plants that are invasive in Hawaii. And there's a number of reasons for that, and some that don't automatically come to mind when you think about, regulating invasive species for conservation purposes. In the middle of this slide, you see the Constitution. There are provisions that protect in the Constitution that relate to regulating the sale and a plant. There's due process. If people can't be deprived of their property without due process of law under the 4th and 14th Amendments. They can't be subject to unreasonable searches. So any program of searching for invasive plants and taking them have to be reasonable. I also put the Supremacy Clause. That's a big one. It's one you don't hear about that much, but it says the federal law is the law of the land, and with some exceptions, state law is subordinate to federal law. So if the feds say you can't regulate it, you can't regulate it. And then I also put a little pest in one side and a little plant in the other side of the slide. And that's because the history of laws regulating the movement of plants, it started out regulating plants to prevent pests from impacting agricultural crops. In the 1800s, there's always been laws that's regulating the movement of plants, but it was primarily to protect crops and prohibit pests from moving. It's only been more recently that concerns about biodiversity and watershed protection, endangered species, and those kinds of concerns have developed in the law and restrict the movement of the plants themselves, not just because they move a pest. So on the next slide, we'll talk more about the Supremacy Clause. So in 2000, the federal government adopted the Plant Protection Act. And that says that only the federal government can restrict the importation of a noxious weed, which is basically, that means the plant itself is invasive, or any item to prohibit a plant pest from moving on it. So if there's a plant in Australia that is invasive in Hawaii, but not invasive in the rest of the United States, that law prohibits Hawaii from saying you can't bring it in. It would have to go on the federal noxious weed list. And we're just one state out of 50, and it might be something that's desirable on the mainland, so we'd have to try to get on there, but we can't stop it from coming in. Movement within the states, the federal government can regulate it. Hawaii can regulate it as much as the federal government does if for certain species, and then for other species, if the federal government doesn't regulate it, Hawaii is able to do so. Then movement within the state, pretty much the federal government stays out of that, and Hawaii can make its own rules. Now, this is a lot of information, and maybe if there's questions after, I'll try to cover them. So next slide, please. So there is a federal noxious weed list, and it prohibits anyone from bringing it into the United States or moving interstate. I put the definition, I don't know if you can read it there, of what a federal noxious weed is, and you can see the historical importance of agriculture. It's something that could cause damage to crops, including nursery stock, plant pests, livestock, poultry, or other interests of agriculture, irrigation, navigation. And then at the end, you have natural resources, public health, and the environment. So if it's on that list, it can't come into Hawaii. So that's one way we prohibit it. And then the next slide. So, oops. Did we go? I think we need to go back one. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. Hawaii requirements. So this is for plants moving within the United States, what Hawaii can do to prevent them from coming in. And there's three main legal mechanisms they have available. The first is the plant import restrictions. And this is kind of the older regulations that are intended only to prevent the movement of pests. So they stop the movement of certain plants because those plants might have pests that impact agriculture. And the species that are regulated, that are intended to be protected are like sugarcane, pineapple, coffee, passion fruit, taro, and other species. So for instance, they prohibit the importation of all grasses to prevent a pest of sugarcane coming in from grasses. The next tool available is the restricted plant list. This was a statute that was enacted in 2000. It directs the Hawaii Department of Agriculture to make a list of specific plants that need a permit for import, or then they can restrict the sale of those plants. And it can either be because the plant itself is invasive or because it would carry a pest. Right now, there is no restricted plant list per se. It's still a tool out there that's available for the Hawaii Department of Agriculture to use in the future. But then in 2008, the legislature made a law that said anything that is on the Hawaii state noxious weed list cannot be imported into Hawaii except in very limited circumstances for research and cannot be sold in Hawaii. And it's kind of interesting to note here the difference the legislature and the laws have taken with respect to invasive animals and invasive plants in Hawaii. For an animal, any animal, it has to be on a list that's approved and you have to have a permit for it. For plants, you can bring in all plants unless it's in one of these relatively small groups of restricted plants. Okay, next slide, please. So then the next way that invasive plants are regulated in Hawaii is movement within the state. And there's a couple of tools available for that. There's Chapter 72 of the Hawaii Administrative Rules, which is the plant pest rules, and that prohibits the movement of a plant that's infested with a pest from moving around the state. Again, it doesn't stop a noxious weed from moving around. It's if the plant has a pest on it, it can't be moved inter-island. The next would be permit conditions, something that we were talking about required a permit to be imported. It could include conditions that say it can't be moved. And then the last one is the noxious weed list. So each species on the state noxious weed list, there's the species, and then it designates the area that is free or reasonably free or relatively free of that plant. So you can't move a noxious weed to an area that is designated as free or relatively free of that noxious weed. Unfortunately, that list was last updated in 1992, so it doesn't fully reflect the current distribution of where the noxious weeds are and maybe the noxious weeds that would be the highest concern to Hawaii. And with that, I'll hand it over to Chuck to talk about noxious weeds.
Thanks. That was a great introduction, Stephanie. And I always learn something every time. I think I understand, and then there's always something new that comes up. But yeah, I wanted to talk about the state and federal noxious weeds. And Stephanie kind of gave a definition of what a noxious weed is from the state, in addition to the harms it can cause to agriculture, the environment, or human or animal health. A noxious weed also has to meet at least one requirement in each of the 5 criteria that are listed here. And I'm not going to go into those in detail, but just generally how a plant reproduces, whether by seed or vegetatively, how it grows and whether it can compete with crops or, native ecosystems, the detrimental effects it can have in these types of places, how difficult a species is to control and whether are there any effective means to control it. That's taken into consideration for listing a noxious weed. And then, as Stephanie was mentioning, the distribution of the plant, where it occurs in the islands and how widespread it is. Also affected which plants were considered for inclusion on the noxious weeds. Next slide, please. So here they are in all their glory. This is the Hawaii state noxious weeds. These are all going to be on the test, so take a moment to memorize them. As of now, there are 75 species and 4 genera of plants that meet the definition of and are officially designated as state noxious weeds. And these include some really notorious invasive plants like Hoster's curse or Clydemia hirta. If anybody's gone hiking on a trail, you probably encountered it. Fountain grass, very widespread invasive grass, especially out here on the Big Island, highly flammable. Pasture and subalpine weeds like gorse are on this list, as well as both widespread and some rather obscure plants. Next slide, please. Okay, and in addition to those state noxious weeds, we do have the federal noxious weeds as well, as Stephanie mentioned. This includes 112 species or genera, and these are these can be broadly grouped into these categories of 19 aquatic plants, 5 parasitic, and 88 terrestrial or land plants. So next slide, please. Okay, so now we know how many state and federal noxious weeds there actually are, and that's about 191 species or genera on both lists. So now let's review how many non-native plants are actually in the Hawaiian Islands that either are or could potentially become invasive plants. So to begin, there's estimated right now, or I should say there's officially reported to be 1,493 naturalized non-native plants in the Hawaiian Islands. And this is according to the online flora that's hosted by the Smithsonian Institution. Naturalized refers to a non-native species that can sustain itself through self-reproducing populations for several cycles or for a given period of time without direct intervention by people or in spite of human intervention. Now, this total of naturalized plants actually outnumbers all known native plant species from the Hawaiian Islands. That total is 1,369. And that includes ones that are extinct. So our island flora is now more non-native than it is native. And this naturalized list is definitely an underestimate, but it does give us a first indication of what plants either are or could become invasive or cause problems here. Now, there's also cultivated plants in Hawaii that are not reported to be naturalized yet. And there's estimates of, roughly 10 to 15,000 cultivated non-native plants in the islands. Many of these which are either could become naturalized and invasive, or maybe already are, and we just haven't detected them yet. On top of that, there are many, many more plants that could be introduced for future cultivation. And according to some estimates, there are between 250,000 to 400,000 plant species worldwide. And that's a huge pool to potentially introduce a future invasive species. This total of all plants worldwide can include rare or rarely cultivated plants, about which little may be known. So even they could be invasive and we just don't know anything about them. And it can also include very notorious invasive species like the tree of heaven, or Ailanthus altissima, pictured here, which is highly invasive on the mainland, but it's not on any state or federal noxious weed list. Next slide, please. So the last slide should give you an indication that the number of listed state and federal noxious weeds is vastly outnumbered by the pool of naturalized, cultivated, and future cultivated plants. But the story isn't all bleak. For example, our current noxious weed list includes 4 entire genera of plants with a total of, over 2,400 taxa, and only 9 species within those genera are currently known to be naturalized or invasive in the Hawaiian Islands. And 3 of these genera are from the Melastome family of plants, which has got a lot of highly invasive species in it. And it includes such notorious invaders as Myconia calvescens, Coster's curse, mentioned it earlier, and Tibicina herbacea. And most of the species in these 4 genera on the state noxious weed list are not currently known to be invasive anywhere in the world. But because of the reputation of the other species in the genus, they're included on the noxious weed list. So in this instance, although they're not yet invasive, and some of these, have never even been cultivated before, their inclusion does provide some preemptive protection for Hawaii. So in other words, not all noxious weeds are currently invasive plants, at least not yet. And we hope that continues to be the case. Next slide, please. So now here's a tale of 2 invasive grasses in the same genus, Cordydaria, which includes about 20 species worldwide. On the left, we have Cordydaria jubata, or pampas grass, an invasive species that's being actively controlled on the island of Maui, and it's highly invasive in other parts of the world, especially California and New Zealand. And because of its reputation in those places, Cordydaria jubata is listed as a state noxious weed. But on the right, we have a very similar looking Cordydaria celowana, which is also present in the islands. And it's highly invasive in other parts of the world as well, especially California. And because of its feathery plumes, it's also pretty popular for decorative plant arrangements, ornamental purposes, as Aaron mentioned at the beginning. But unfortunately, at the time of, the last time noxious weeds were listed in the state, it was believed that Cordydaria celowana would not become invasive because it has separate male and female plants that are required to produce seeds. But, we've since learned that it's pretty difficult, even for a trained botanist, to distinguish male from female plants, and it's impossible to tell them apart from seed. Research in California has also shown that of the 2, Cordydaria celowana is probably the more invasive and detrimental to the natural environment. So in spite of this knowledge, and although it is invasive, it is not currently listed as a state noxious weed. So Cordydaria jubata, noxious, invasive, other one not. And finally, so to conclude my portion of my presentation, almost all noxious weeds are invasive plants, but the overwhelming majority of actual or potential invasive plants are not regulated as noxious weeds at the state or federal level. And that suits some people just fine. So I will pass it along to Jonathan now, and he can take it from here.
All right. Good evening, everyone. So so I'll just do a little bit about, I think, what, the plant quarantine branch does with regards to inspections. you know, Chuck and Stephanie have done a good job of kind of highlighting, I think, some of the, you know, the issues with regards to invasive plants. And, you know, I'll talk specifically, I think, more about what we do. So, so the first thing is the plant quarantine branch, we have quite a broad mandate in terms of what things are actually inspected. So for all intents and purposes, it's agricultural products, plants, plant parts, so fruits, vegetables, cut flowers, unmanufactured wood, logs, basically plant products in the raw or natural state. We also regulate non-domestic animals and non-cultures of microorganisms, but obviously outside the scope of what we're talking about today. So these things, the requirement statutorily is that they are inspected upon entry into the state. So whether that be a container ship, a passenger's baggage, mail, FedEx, UPS, DHX, you know, whatever it may be, private jet, private boat, these things must be declared and they must be inspected prior to entry. So all of the, so what happens is we have inspectors statewide who are at the ports of entry conducting inspections. So, you know, 90% of the goods that we that we use, you know, are imported. So, you know, we have quite a lot of work to do. The higher risk goods that we normally find are obviously through air. One of the challenges, you know, again, with regards to inspections is that, you know, everybody is a seller nowadays, you know, with the onsets of things like Etsy, Facebook Marketplace, Amazon. Everything can be gotten from anywhere the next day. And it's very hard to educate everyone about everybody else's rules. So, you know, there's, for all intents and purposes, a lot of inadvertent smuggling. And then you have, you know, actual smuggling of things. Regarding to the regs, Stephanie brought up that, you know, Chapter 70 does exist. And, you know, a lot of our interceptions come through the non-compliance portions of those rules. So orchids, bromeliads, grasses, things like that. So you have non-compliance issues for, you know, lack of permits, lack of phytosanitary certificates, treatments, things like that. You also do have pest issues. Upon entry, inspectors are looking actively for insects, diseases, any type of hitchhiker that could be with a shipment. Should there be something found, the shipments are placed on hold, samples are collected, submitted for identification. Based on the identification of whatever is collected, the plant or the shipment may be destroyed, may be sent out of state, or potentially subjected to a treatment which would eradicate the organism that was found. So it really depends on the situation. For example, you know, you have a container of animal feed that's infested with beetles. The treatment is probably far more cost effective than sending it, you know, an entire 40-foot container back. You have one box of flowers for somebody on Valentine's Day, you know, sending that particular parcel back, obviously cheaper than treating it. So it really depends on the situation and the pest. Inspections are constant. You know, goods are moving on a daily basis, 24 hours a day. Well, not 24 hours a day, but, you know, most of the time. For example, in Honolulu, we have inspectors that go to FedEx. There are 3 inspectors that go on a daily basis, well, Monday through Saturday. And there's basically 3 belts. You have one belt for Honolulu proper, you have one belt for the rest of Oahu, and then one belt for the rest of the state. And you're getting 35 to 40,000 boxes a day. That's just mail at FedEx. UPS is larger. You have the Postal Service. Again, you have air cargo. You have baggage. So, you know, you see some photos here of inspectors kind of getting their hands dirty. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I think one of the things with inspections is, you know, I know you can't see my uniform, the light blue, but a lot of people do confuse the state inspectors with the federal ones. So there is a federal quarantine for fruit flies, which prevents fruit going to the mainland. And that's the real reason why baggage is screened going out, not necessarily coming in. And that's really to, for all intents and purposes, to protect the mainland from Hawaii. And then you have things about like where customs is, and like Stephanie really kind of hit the nail on this. The state is preempted really from dealing with regulation in federal commerce. So once things are outside of federal commerce, the state does have the ability to take some action, and our ability to take action is actually broader than the federal folks in terms of we don't necessarily have a list of actionable pests. So there are opportunities, I think, there to kind of close that particular gap. But anyway, just a few minutes about inspections, and I'll be available for some questions, I think, if anybody has them. And then yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. So we've learned about plants that have rules and laws associated with them. So let's talk about invasive plants. Myth: invasive plants are not sold here. So here we have 3 very common plants that are sold in nurseries and garden centers throughout the state. Octopus tree, asparagus fern, and shrubby delinia or simpo. They don't look evil. They look pretty nice. They're just for sale in a garden store, right? Next slide. So each of them have scored high risk on the Hawaii invasive species, Hawaii Pacific weed risk assessment. So they're all high risk. So we know that they are high risk of becoming invasive, but these plants are all actually invasive. We can see it right before our eyes. So the picture on the left is an octopus tree, and this is kind of a good story, kind of. Well, recently a concerned citizen emailed us so upset that this plant was being sold at a store. So I, talked to him and said, I'm so sorry, but Hawaii has really permissive laws when it comes to the sale of invasive plants, and there's not much we can do. Well, he took it a step beyond and actually called that garden store manager and told the manager how invasive it is and why they shouldn't be selling it. So that was really good. And it takes people like us, everyday people, to talk to garden centers and nurseries and explain why things shouldn't be sold. So we're really thankful for this person. So obviously falsified. Invasive plants are sold here every day. So here are 3 pictures of those plants we just looked at for sale that are actually invading. All of them put out these kind of like bright berries that are delicious to birds. So these non-native fruit-eating birds are spreading these plants. So we have invasive species spreading invasive seeds. So octopus tree, it's kind of easy to see because it's got those bright red tentacles. You can see that growing on other trees as an epiphyte or possibly in gutters. On the bottom, we have asparagus fern. I took this picture and it was far away from any home, so a bird must have brought it and dropped the seed, and now it's growing. I mean, that's not just a problem for the forest and natural areas, but for homeowners. It is really hard to get rid of it once it gets established. A professional landscaper recently told me that one of her clients asked for the company to get rid of that plant in her yard, and the company laughed because it's going to take so much money. They have to basically evacuate the whole ground, excavate it, and take all of the soil out because it'll grow from every little piece of root. Not to mention how hard it is to get into it to work with it. So that's a landscaping nightmare. And then we have shrubby Dillenia, which is growing in parts of Manoa, in the lower ridges and valleys, in Oahu. It's not established on Hawaii Island yet. So in 2017, I did a full survey of every nursery I could gain entry into on Hawaii Island. And out of about 50 nurseries, we found that more than 55% were selling one or more invasive plant. And that's about when we started the Plant Pono program, which is a program to teach residents and community members how to choose non-invasive plants for their yards and landscapes. And it's also an endorsement program, Kauai and Hawaii Island, we both have it, where we work with nurseries and ones that agree to not sell certain invasive plants, we endorse and promote as much as we can. Next slide. So I'm very happy to say that now it's only about 20% of nurseries on Hawaii Island that sell invasive plants. But invasive plants are still sold here. Here we have night blooming jasmine, which is one of the top 5 invasive plants in my opinion. So on the left, it looks pretty nice, nothing wrong with it. It's for sale at a garden store. But the picture in the middle is what happens after you plant it. And it makes these bright white berries that birds just love. And each one of those berries contains seeds. It's all a chance for a bird to eat and move into natural areas. So on the right, it's hard to see, but in that red circle, we have a keiki night blooming jasmine. And in the background, we have a young koa grove. So you go down the road just a little bit more, and you can see the koa trees are much bigger. The whole understory is all night blooming jasmine, which means when the koa make seeds and drop their seeds, it's outcompeted by the night blooming jasmine immediately. It cannot grow because the night blooming jasmine is taking up all the space, all the nutrients, everything. And once these koa reach the end of their life and they die, all we're going to have is a field of night blooming jasmine. And obviously that is not good for biodiversity, percolating water into the watershed, or holding soil intact. So again, myths, invasive species are not sold here. So on the left, we have a pampas grass plume that I was alerted that it was for sale at the Kona Home Depot. So I went there as soon as I can, and I talked to the manager of the store and told her that it's a noxious weed and she should not be selling it. Thankfully, she listened to me and took the display down right in front of me. So no more at Kona Home Depot. Very proud of them. Meanwhile, in the middle, we have some pampas grass growing, and this is or was a bisque eradication target for eradication on Hawaii Island. And we are proud to say that we have eradicated every known population on Hawaii Island. It took many, many years and a lot of outreach, but we did it. But all I can say is every known population, because on the right, this is a seed packet that I was trying to buy when I was preparing this presentation, and I can get it at any time. I could get pampas grass. How is the Department of Agriculture gonna check every little bit of mail? Like Jonathan Ho said, now with Etsy, the US mail, it's just so much is coming through and it's impossible to check everything. So in theory, I could get these pampas grass seeds and germinate them and grow them. But also, we don't know what variety or what species it is. Is it Cordaderia celoana or jubata? We know they're both invasive, but one is noxious and against the law. So speaking of mislabeled plants, Erin talked about this earlier. Here we have Calea ternifolia, otherwise known as Mexican dream herb, which is a plant that's widely for sale on the internet. Well, a friend of a friend bought some seeds from the internet and grew that seed and then gave it to a friend I knew. And he said, here, Joe, here's some Mexican dream herb. So Joe took that plant and put it into his yard and didn't do much more with it. Next slide. Joe's not the best at landscaping, so he did just leave it in his yard. And like the night blooming jasmine, it covered his yard. Meanwhile, we knew in about 2020 that devilweed was on Hawaii Island. It's a noxious weed, and it was in a lot of locations. So we did a huge outreach push and taught people how to identify it. And then I was alerted to come down to Joe's house. Next slide. This plant took over like a quarter of his yard. And thankfully I went down there and I was able to say, Joe, this is actually devilweed. This is a noxious weed. Well, the BIS crew came out the next day and got rid of it. So Joe does not have to worry about it. And thankfully it didn't spread into neighboring properties, but it wasn't his fault. Like, he was given a plant, he believed his friend, and look what happened. They look very similar. You can't really blame anybody. They have a similar habit. They really look the same. The leaves look similar. They've both got the longitudinal veination. The flowers look the same. They have the same growth habit, like I said, but there are some differences, like the flower color. So it's kind of easy. The devilweed here on Hawaii Island has purple flowers. Mexican dream herb has white or cream flowers. Devilweed has more styles and longer styles on the flower. So it has more of a messy hair look, but a really, like, if it's not flowering, because things aren't always flowering, a really good way, if you can go up to the plant, is to actually smell it. Rub the leaf and smell your hand. Devilweed smells like turpentine. And I've never seen Mexican dream herb, but I've been talking to people that actually grow it. They say the leaf doesn't smell like anything. So we found out it was being sold widely on the internet, and I reached out to many, many people that were selling Cromalena odorata and calling it Calea ternifolia. And I just let them know, listen, you've misidentified the plant. This is how you've done it. It's okay. Like, you know, we all make mistakes, but also it's against the law to sell import noxious weeds to Hawaii. And I gave them the laws, and it kind of worked, because if you can see in the arrows, they say now they're not going to ship to Hawaii. But if you think that possibly, especially for a plant that you're going to ingest, if you don't know what it is, you should take it down to the Department of Agriculture, your local botanist or invasive species committee, and make sure you know what the plant is before you ingest it. On to Stephanie.
Thanks so much, Molly. That was great. I learned a lot. So now that we've busted these myths, what's next? Are there any actions going on in the state to address invasive plants more specifically? There is a big one right now. I talked about Chapter 72, and Jonathan talked about Chapter 72 of the Hawaii Administrative Rules, which is regulates movement within the state. Because I have a legal background, all my slides are words, and I thought the most interesting thing was a meeting agenda, because this week, the revision of Chapter 72 went before the advisory committee, and they made recommendations and voted to move it on to the Board of Agriculture with their recommendations. The current revision of Chapter 72 makes all the plants that are currently on the Hawaii State Noxious Weed List, designates them as pests, and allows the Hawaii Department of Agriculture to restrict their movement within the state more significantly than just using that list that we have now that says you can't move it to an area that was relatively free of it in 1992. So that's a very, it's a big step with respect to preventing the movement of species that are designated as noxious weeds in Hawaii. Right now, my understanding is that it will be heard by the Board of Agriculture at a public meeting on February 28th. That is not set in stone. That is my understanding at this time, but they will consider it and whether or not to move the modified rules forward. If they vote to do so, it will become a proposed administrative rule. Both the board meeting and proposed administrative rules are available on the board, the Hawaii Department of Ag's website. For the Board of Ag, it's a public meeting. People can listen, can submit testimony if they want to, if they have any thoughts about the proposal. And then it will be listed as a proposed rule, and then it will go to public hearing later this year. So that's one thing that's happening with respect to it. Next slide, please. Another thing that the Hawaii Department of Agriculture is doing is they are considering modifying the plant import list to add firewood. Again, it doesn't, not because firewood obviously is invasive species, it's dead wood, but because it can bring in a variety of invasive pests. They've had 2 scoping meetings in 2022 to let industry that sells firewood know that this is something they're considering. Many other states have restrictions with respect to firewood, require it to be heat treated and properly labeled so that it's not infested with pests when it's brought into the state. But as part of that process, they may look at other rules in Chapter 70 that will be up to them at that time. And with that, I will hand it off.
Thank you, guys. So we had a lot of information, and basically it boils down to, as of now, until some of these rules and regulations get changed and updated, which can take some time, it's kind of up to us to figure out what we can buy. And it can be anxiety inducing, and we feel bad if we choose something that is invasive. So you don't have to stress. There's actually tools that can help us. So you don't know what to buy or not to buy. It's actually easier than you think. There are a couple of websites that are really going to help you out. The easiest one that's really easy to use is plantpono.org. So when you go to this website, you can screenshot it or just type it into your phone, and you want to plant something in your yard, but you want to make sure it's not invasive. You can go to this little bar right here and click on Find a Pono Plant. When you do that, it actually gives you these options to where you can say, I'm looking for a shrub and I want something with red or orange flowers, and I want to make sure that it's not invasive. You can filter out your searches. I want a tree, I want a vine, I want some ferns, I want ground cover, I want a hedge. There's all of these options for you. You can even get it down to how much sun your yard receives. So that's an easy way to just make sure that you're buying something that is not invasive. If you've already bought something and you think it might be invasive, then you can go down to this little box here and you can search the common name, or if you know the scientific name. When you do that, it will bring up what you bought. So let's say I purchased some of those Tree of Heaven cuttings and I got it here, and I'm listening to this and I think, oh snap, I bought some Tree of Heaven. What is the deal with it? So you type it in and it's going to give you the risk score. But even beyond that, it can say, go ahead and get rid of it and plant these instead. So it'll give you options. So it's really easy to use, and it's a really great interface, and I highly recommend that people use this. If you go to Plant Pono and you don't find a plant on there, you can email them and say, can you do a weed risk assessment on whatever the plant is? And it'll take them about a week or a couple weeks. They get a backlog, but they will go ahead and do that weed risk assessment, which looks at 40 some odd characteristics of how the plant spread, how it grows, what's the invasive risk, and they can get that score for you. So plantpono.org, I highly recommend using it. And then if you are on Oahu, the Board of Water Supply also has a planting guide. Now, Plant Pono gives you options for native species, but also non-invasive species. But if you really want to start just a strictly native garden in your area on Oahu, you can go to the Board of Water Supply Conservation Tips website, and you can select what zone you live in, and they will give you a list of nothing but Hawaiian plants. And it will also tell you, this is all based on how much water you receive in your area. Another really good guide that you can use statewide is the State Department of Transportation Highways Division. They actually have a planting guide that's listed on their website, and that is the Landscape Architecture Program. So this will also give you nothing but native Hawaiian plants, but it tells you on which zone you live in, how much water you receive, what are the best plants, and it has them listed by trees, shrubs, fern, and even grasses. So there are a lot of options out there that can help you so that you don't get overwhelmed and anxious. So that myth has been busted. So right now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we will go through the question and answer portion. See that we do have some stuff in the Q&A. Franny asked, how many inspectors does HDOA have currently throughout the state? This is be for Jonathan. And are there many positions still unfilled?
Sorry. Oh, so right now, so the plant quarantine branch has a total of 82 people statewide. So that's everybody. That's not necessarily just inspectors. So I think there's 71 inspectors statewide. What did I write? I was counting in my head. 71 inspectors statewide. The 12 vacancies and 7 are in active recruitment. We just what's today? Yeah. So this week we finished hiring our 7th new inspector for Oahu. So we lost quite a few people last year. So we got 7 new guys in the last 3 weeks. We're recruiting 3 more for Oahu, 2 on Maui, 2 in, is it 4? No, sorry, 4 on Oahu, 2 on Maui, and 3 in Hawaii Island. So yeah, we're making headway, kind of going back to like, I guess like pre-RIF times, or back 15 years ago. But I think as everybody has seen, there's a lot of things that come in, and you're looking at a small portion of the state budget, and having 60 people trying to cover all of this stuff is a challenge.
So Jonathan, just a follow up to that question, I heard somewhere that the state budget that's dedicated to Department of Agriculture is about 0.2%. Is that true?
I think the entire department gets, I think, 0.38, I believe, for the general fund. I think it's 0.38, something like that. Let's see, I think the department has like 340 positions total, something like that. So, and then obviously plant quarantine is one. You have plant pest control, you have pesticides, you have ag resource management, animal industry. So, there's a huge mission and, a very small piece of the pie. I mean, for some context, like DLNR gets like 1.1% or so, 1% or something like that. So you think of like the 2 agencies for conservation, like the 2 major state agencies for conservation and, I guess the first line of defense, PQ, you're getting what, less than 1.5% of the state budget. And yeah.
And then just to follow up on that, just for clarification, someone asked, so is that 0.38% part of the less than 1% overall that's dedicated to conservation?
So yeah, so the general fund budget that's allocated for the entire Department of Agriculture is, I believe, 0.38%. And then DLNR gets about like 1 or 1.1%. So 1.5% of the state budget for DLNR and for Department of Ag. And, obviously DLNR is a very large agency. You have the land board, you have all these other parks and recreation, things like that. So, you have a whole bunch of other functions that are held there.
Yeah, small portion. We have another question. I don't know if this would probably go to Stephanie. What would it take to get rules changed so that Hawaii could export foods such as avocados and prevent invasives or other non-natives from being brought in? So what would it take to get some of those rules changed?
Well, Jonathan, are avocados prohibited from being exported from Hawaii?
Yes and no. It depends on the variety. So basically, what it boils down to is this goes back to the baggage screening when you leave the state. So there's basically a federal quarantine for fruit flies for Hawaii, for all intents and purposes, to protect California. And they're, I think, what, $4 or $5 billion ag industry. So fleshy fruit cannot go to the mainland. I think Charwool avocados are the only ones that can go. If they're grown in they have a certain growing standards and packing standards that they have to maintain, and they can ship those. But I believe that's the only variety currently. There are mechanisms to basically petition USDA to conduct a study to be able to show that a particular fruit or variety or cultivar is able to, and your the cultivar in addition to your mitigation or processing measures to prevent the export of federally actionable pests such as fruit flies. So there's a way to do it. It's very complicated and it takes a lot of time. And I think the Charwool one, I don't know, it took them years to get it done. And it was only that one variety that they were able to get. So that's the mechanism. And then I think, was the second part was for import or?
Yeah, what would it take to get the rules changed to prevent invasives or their non-natives from being brought in?
So I guess it would depend on the particular species, whether it be a plant or an animal. And then,
plants.
Yeah, so with regards to plants, Stephanie had mentioned the restricted plant list. That's probably, I think, to restrict a plant because the plant in of itself is detrimental. The department has kind of dabbled in it, and we do actually have we worked with, it was with CGAPs to come up with some draft, like a shell of rules for that. And hopefully we can then implement that. And then once those rules are in place, there is a mechanism to basically try to initiate rule amendments. To go through the public process.
Stephanie, is there anything you want to add to that? I know you're working on this too.
Oh, no, that was a great answer. Just that, HDOA has, as Jonathan pointed out, a small budget, a small staff, and a huge mandate. And so, a lot of these rules are out of date and they are like getting to them, as they can. Right now they're working on Chapter 72. It hasn't been updated in what was one update like in 2016, but basically 20 years. So it's I think a comprehensive overhaul, 30 years. So, these are heavy lifts, and the rulemaking process is a very long, labor intensive process. They have to take one of those, people, 82 people, or whatever the number Jonathan said is, put them on making a rule. So it is a big lift, and when they do it, it is good for the public to look at it and provide input. So, and then for other things, what might require actual change at the legislature. So there are a number of steps that would be required.
And Stephanie or Jamie or Jonathan, would you guys be able to drop in the chat where people can go to provide that testimony? Excellent, thank you. And I appreciate that. Just to back up on the avocados, clarification is perhaps another way to ask the question is, what would it take to get Hawaii grown avocados to be more easily sold in supermarkets here in Hawaii versus the California avocados?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think, again, I think one of the biggest challenges that any agricultural producer has in the state is that they have to pay so much more to get all their resources here to produce their products. Fertilizer, everything costs more in Hawaii because you have to basically get it on a ship. And, and land is, exorbitantly more expensive. So, they're basically behind the 8 ball, with regards to anything that's produced. And, and it's unfortunate that, the high cost of living, basically, people are like, there's a $5 avocado and a $2 avocado from Mexico. They're going to buy the $2 one. And, Hawaii products really to survive are really becoming, I think, like premium for all intents and purposes, just to be able to stay alive. And it's unfortunate in that by becoming more premium, it makes it just much less accessible. And without finding ways to lower shipping costs to make things more competitive with the mainland, well, and obviously the cost of land and stuff like that, until those things can be really leveled, local producers are always going to be behind the 8 ball. And without having really concerted outreach or events that really highlight how much better like fresh and local grown things are, it's really hard because a lot of people are like, again, I can buy 2 avocados for the price of this one. They're not going to take the jump, and it's trying to find ways to get them to experience those things. And they're like, wow, this is so much better. And then once people experience it, then they're more willing to splurge and for all intents and purposes buy local. And I went to the mainland and I was on a farm tour, and we went to basically an apple orchard. And in Hawaii we only have certain kinds of apples, and you go over there and you're like, what is this? Like all these things that you've never experienced. And then you tell them you should come to Hawaii and try mangoes or avocados, and they're like, what? Really? And you're like, you have no idea what you're missing, And it's kind of that same thing. It's how do you get that out to the people that are here? And it's really tough, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. We do grow some of the best products here. And just we're running out of time, but somebody did have a question about, do kids learn about native plants in schools in Hawaii? This is public schools, sort of outside charter schools. And I'll just go ahead and take this one since Jamie and I work in outreach for OISC on Oahu. Each of the invasive species committees has an outreach team. And this is one of our main missions, is to go to K through 12 schools and talk about impacts of invasive species and what native species are. And a lot of these public schools do have sort of a farm to school program where not only they learn about agricultural crops, but they do incorporate native species information too. I can say on Oahu, it's a little bit more challenging because it's harder for us to see native species just in our environment versus, somewhere like Big Island where you have ohia everywhere. So yeah, if you can share it with your kids and your family about native species, that's wonderful to do too.